From an outsider's perspective, I think you can fall in the trap of believing that it's just natural. Like this person's a great athlete. They're a great verbal athlete, and I could never do this. But there's a lot of, as you're describing, there's a lot of thought and a lot of discipline and theory behind this. But how do you go about like developing material? Like you kind of, do you have an idea of what stories you're going to go in with, how you're going to work the crowd? I know you do a lot
Yeah.
of improv too. How do you develop that cadence and that material?
Yeah, it's a great question. And here's something that as comedians we're taught almost day one is that you always have a notebook with you. You've probably heard this before. You want to have a notebook with you, and you know, now you don't have to have a notebook. You can just have your phone and record it on your device. I am constantly, and I want to say constantly, I mean every single day. Sometimes I can't sleep because I remember stories. I write down every possible nugget of thing that happened to me in my day. We call it like a set list. So you can have a notebook where you just have things that happened in that day or things that happened in that week, and just keep track of it. At some point, the discipline is coming back and going, okay, so what happened? What happened in that moment, right? And what was the moment that caused the big aha moment or something? Wow, this is interesting, or this happened for this client, and you write those stories out, and then eventually what happens is you have now, at the end of that week, you'll have like, oh my gosh, like I'll give you 100 things that have happened to you that week. At some point, you can decide, wow, number one, number 13, and number 47. These are really good. I want to kind of keep developing this content and see where that goes. Because ultimately, any story you tell in a presentation environment, you want to wrap the purpose or the point or the moral of the story, that you're trying to make in that story. Right, like when I said to you earlier about this kid who put out this album, and he wanted that other person to come onto the album with him, his moment of fear. But that story literally it just happened like not even a day ago. But because your question, hey, how do you deal with imposter syndrome, with not believing in yourself, and that story immediately came to mind. I wrote it down as, oh, I need to develop the story, right? Which is why I didn't give you a bunch of detail. I just wrote it down. So keeping a some sort of journal on your phone, on your like Evernote, and writing down things that happen, and start to later develop them as this could be a presentation. And then over time, what you do is you decide, okay, this is like a two-minute story, or a 60-second story, or a 5-minute story, because you can kind of whittle it down. But ultimately, you have now a set list, right? And I can literally go into, somebody tells me, hey, literally somebody called me today, hey, we have a meeting at noon, and can you come in and do something on happiness? Done. Because I have this plethora of stories that I can come into the conversation with, of the points I'm trying to make. So yeah, just keeping track of that would be key.
One thing that was weird to me when I started speaking a little more frequently
Oh, sure.
was how frequently I tell the same story, and it felt weird to me because I've heard the story before. It felt unnatural to go into it rehearsed. But what I realized is no one on my team, like as a leader speaking to teams, no one remembered any of that, or very rarely. But every
Yes.
time I told it, I told a little better, little better, little better. And then, by the time presentation day comes,
Yep.
I've got, like you said, kind of a set list. I've never thought of it that way, but 2, 3, 4 anecdotes that relate back to what I want to talk about that kind of drive the point home. And then you deliver those stories, and maybe you get pretty good at delivering them because you've been kind of practicing them out in the field a little bit. But it's
No,
so much more engaging, and no one calls you on telling that story 10 times. Now, I know for sure there's guys on my team that have heard that story 5 times, but they didn't
that's a
even
great
notice
story.
or mention it. They're good with it. They're just like, yeah, that's exactly the point. And that's some weird insecurity that I
Yes.
think amateur
No,
speakers
listen,
get.
listen.
It's like
Here's
weird to
what
rehearse,
I say. It is not
but
even.
it goes well.
So I'm 100% a believer of rehearsal. But here's a couple of things again from the comedy world. So open mics are designed so that comics can test the material. And a number of years ago, I want to say about 4 or 5 years ago, I happened to be in New York,
Yeah.
and I was actually at a comedy university taking training for like a week. It was an amazing event, and on that Friday, a few of us decided, hey, why don't we go to the comedy cellar? You have to hit the right comedy clubs, and we went to the comedy cellar. The show was sold out. We were kind of bummed to be like, oh my gosh, what do we do? And the security guy was like, listen, if you come back around 11 o'clock, they may start letting people back in. We have I think it was like a midnight show or something. I'm like, gosh, that's late, but let's do it. And so we did. We came back. They let us in, watched a bunch of comics, and all of a sudden, the guy says, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chris Rock. What? And he was not part of the lineup, but that's what these guys do. And he brought out the notebook, sat it down, and looks down, and he goes,
Yeah.
all right, this one. And then he starts, right? And so you're like, oh my God, he has a notebook. Like, this is what, like, oh, cool, let's go. Now, I will tell you that in that story, it was not Chris Rock who had come on stage. It was someone else that I don't want to talk about because he was canceled. All right, he was canceled, and so I'm like, all right, so changing the characters, who cares? Nobody, whether who or what wasn't. The point was they carried notebooks. Well, the other was one of my absolute favorite comics. I hope he cleans his life up, and you know, it sounds like his name sounds like a perfume with CK in it. But the point is, the Calvin Klein. But the point is, he had a notebook. And he put his notebook down, and he was working on some material. I'm like, this is how actual professionals work. And so the room becomes your testing. The presenter, when you're telling that story in smaller groups, you're testing the material. And here's something I'm going to share with you, Christian, that you absolutely want to do. When you tell stories, or anybody who's listening to this, when you tell stories in a group just to test out the material, listen and watch for the people's responses. Right, for the key words that you put in there, the key things you say, the funny moments you have, the punchlines you have. Watch their responses. But here's something even better: watch or listen to what they tell you, like as a response, because it could become part of the story, right? And so what happens is people help you to quote unquote write the story because you're testing it with a group. It doesn't matter, and that to me is rehearsal. But you're testing the material with different groups. I listen to what they say, bits of information. I'm like, oh, that was a better line that I had. I like that word. I'm going to write that down. And so the next time I tell a story, I told it with really being written by a bunch of other people in the process, which is why it changes. Yes.